This video was produced as part of South Carolina State Park's commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. It explores the causes of this momentous event in world history, discusses South Carolina's decision to join the struggle, and documents the revolutionary origins of the state's beloved flag. Known for its beaches, historic sites, and southern hospitality, South Carolina also possesses one of the country's most distinctive state flags. With its iconic white crescent and palmetto emblazoned on a field of indigo blue, this banner consistently polls in the top 5 of the nation's best. It seems odd that such a graceful standard could have its roots in a time of political unrest and armed conflict, but its first iteration was conceived about 7 months after the shot heard round the world, as the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson later described the 1775 start of the American War for Independence at the battles of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Before discussing the origins of the flag itself, let's take a moment to investigate the causes of the conflict that led to its design. The reasons why 13 North American colonies joined together in rebellion against one of the most powerful nations on earth ranged from the political and philosophical to the economic and cultural. Nevertheless, the main source of tension that set hostilities in motion was Great Britain's effort to exert greater control over its provinces in the early 1760s, following its victory in the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in the colonies. Already a fearsome power on the global stage, the Britain of King George III now found itself in possession of French Canada and Spanish Florida. The war with France, however, had depleted its treasury, and the national debt was piling up. Thus, the island nation required additional revenue to cover the costs of its empire. Prime Minister George Grenville believed it was time for the colonies to shoulder more of the financial burden. The economic theory informing British policy emphasized a positive balance of trade, meaning that a country's exports should greatly exceed its imports. Imports from foreign nations were discouraged because they enriched the coffers of rival countries at the expense of one's own. Consequently, trade officials argued that goods coming into Britain should come from British sources on British ships. By the mid-18th century, the North American colonies had emerged as a mainstay of the British economy. They were providing the parent country with valuable commodities, many of which were produced by the toil of enslaved Africans, such as tobacco from the Chesapeake and rice and indigo from South Carolina. With increased purchasing power, the colonists were also avidly consuming British-made goods, taking in a quarter of the island nation's exports. Money was being made on both sides of the Atlantic, and imperial oversight of the colony's internal affairs was loose, as was the enforcement of existing trade regulations. The economic recession of the early 1760s, however, would bring an end to this period of greater American autonomy. One of the largest expenses facing the British Empire after the 7 Years' War was the cost of maintaining a standing army of nearly 10,000 men in North America, an army more than twice the size of its pre-war force. British officials argued that these soldiers were necessary to protect the provinces, but many colonists saw them as occupiers whose very presence placed military authority above civilian. It's beyond the scope of this video to cover every incident and issue that led to the revolution, but let's address some of the major points of contention. Parliament's first attempt to collect more revenue from the colonies, the Sugar Act, became law in 1764. This anti-smuggling legislation placed an indirect or external tax on certain commodities, such as sugar, wine, indigo, and coffee, that were imported into the colonies from foreign markets. While it actually lowered the duty on molasses to encourage legal trade, it came with stronger enforcement mechanisms and steeper punishments for lawbreakers. Resentment toward the Sugar Act boiled over into outrage the following year when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which levied a direct or internal tax on the colonies. This law required the colonists to buy special stamped paper and parchment for most printed materials, including legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. Each sheet of paper was impressed with an embossed revenue stamp, while stamps were glued to the thicker parchment. News of this direct tax provoked a firestorm of opposition in America. Mass protests, some featuring mob violence, broke out in cities from Savannah to Boston. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies, including South Carolina, convened the Stamp Act Congress in New York City to draft a formal petition to the British government. They argued that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional because Parliament lacked the jurisdiction to impose taxes on people with no direct representation in the House of Commons. They further asserted that only duly elected representatives from their own colonial assemblies could legally do so. Hence the famous rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." While the Stamp Act Congress deliberated in New York, more than 2,000 people took to the streets of Charlestown, later Charleston, South Carolina, after a ship arrived from London with a consignment of stamped paper. Protesters hanged and then burned the effigy of a stamp distributor and staged a mock funeral for American liberty. During the Stamp Act crisis, many colonists started non-importation associations and began boycotting British goods. This negatively affected the bottom line of British merchants, who appealed to Parliament for the Stamp Act's repeal. Pressured from both sides of the Atlantic, Parliament agreed and revoked the act in early 1766. Yet concurrently, it issued the Declaratory Act, maintaining that it had full legislative authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Stamp Act created a fault line between the 13 colonies and their parent country, a fault line that would continue to widen in ensuing years. Tensions flared again in 1767 when Parliament adopted the plans of Charles Townsend, Britain's chief financial officer. The Townshend Revenue Act, based on the mistaken belief that the colonists were less hostile to indirect taxes, placed new import duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea, and increased the search and seizure powers of customs officials. To further combat illicit trade, the British government installed the American Board of Customs in Boston, Massachusetts, and the following year established naval courts in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, where suspected violators would be tried without a jury. Well versed in the radical anti-authoritarian literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, emerging American revolutionaries viewed Parliament's actions as evidence of a deeper conspiracy to subvert liberty throughout the realm. Corruption in the halls of power, they believed, was undermining the balance of the British Constitution and paving the way to tyranny. The Townshend Act sparked colonial protests and boycotts on a scale even larger than the stamp crisis. Britain attempted to defuse the situation in April 1770 by repealing all of the Townshend duties with the exception of the tax on tea. Afterwards, cooler heads prevailed for a few years, but colonial indignation resurfaced after Parliament passed the Tea Act in May 1773. It granted a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies to the insolvent East India Company, undercutting American merchants in hopes of bailing out the failing joint stock enterprise. In early December, a ship carrying East India Company tea docked at the port of Charleston, South Carolina, where opponents of the tax convinced local merchants to refrain from paying the duties on it. The chests were eventually secured in the exchange and would be sold in 1776, ironically, to help fund the Revolution. A few weeks later, a group of angry Bostonians staged the famous Tea Party, dumping more than 300 chests of the caffeinated leaves in Massachusetts Bay. The conflict escalated quickly after that. Parliament resolved to punish Massachusetts for its impertinence and passed a series of coercive acts in early 1774, closing the port of Boston until restitution was made for the ruined tea, and effectively placing the colony's government under direct British control. It also amended the Quartering Act of 1765, permitting royal governors across the colonies to commandeer private unoccupied buildings to house British soldiers. Alarmed, every colony except Georgia sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. Still hoping to reconcile with Great Britain, the Congress agreed to seek political redress by formally petitioning the king and imposing economic sanctions through boycotts and embargoes. Less than 6 months after the First Continental Congress adjourned, however, blood would be shed at Lexington and Concord. On the eve of the Revolution, South Carolina ranked 8th in population among the 13 colonies, with about 175,000 inhabitants, but boasted the 4th largest city in the provinces, Charleston. Relying heavily on race-based slavery as the system of labor for its cash crop economy, South Carolina was the only British colony in North America that grew to comprise a black majority. Many supporters of independence were also enslavers of Africans, and when they spoke of liberty, they clearly did not intend it for everyone. In terms of loyalty, South Carolina was a divided province. The strongest support for revolution emanated from the more established coastal parishes, while many newer immigrants in the backcountry remained faithful to the crown. South Carolina's leading revolutionaries convened a counter-legislature known as the Provincial Congress in January 1775, directly challenging royal authority and essentially displacing the colony's existing assembly. The Provincial Congress organized the seizure of weapons and powder from Charleston area repositories in April, and then in June raised 3 regiments of soldiers, the 1st and 2nd South Carolina as infantry, and the 3rd South Carolina as mounted rangers. Colonel William Moultrie was appointed commander of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. The Provincial Congress also created a Council of Safety based in Charleston to oversee military affairs. In mid-September, South Carolina's last royal governor, William Campbell, who had only been in office for 3 months, suspected that Patriot forces were planning to seize Fort Johnson, the principal stronghold protecting Charleston Harbor. Lacking the troops to defend it, he sent a naval force from the sloop of war Tamar to disable its 21 guns under the cover of darkness. The Revolutionary Council of Safety had, in fact, authorized Colonel William Moultrie, the senior officer in Charleston at the time, to capture the fort. Detachments from the 1st and 2nd South Carolina took possession of it without a fight the morning after Campbell's raid and were able to salvage the guns. Deeming his position untenable, Campbell absconded with the colony's Great Seal and took refuge on the Tamar in Charleston Harbor, where he would spend 2 more months vainly trying to restore imperial control. Soon after American forces occupied Fort Johnson, Colonel Moultrie's soldiers hoisted a striking new banner above its tabby ramparts, one designed by the colonel himself. It was an indigo blue flag with a white crescent in the upper corner of its staff side, also known as the Dexter Corner. Moultrie later described the inspiration for the flag in his memoirs. He wrote, quote, "A little time after we were in possession of Fort Johnson, it was thought necessary to have a flag for the purpose of signals. As there was no national or state flag at the time, I was desired by the Council of Safety to have one made. Upon which, as the state troops were clothed in blue, and the fort was garrisoned by the 1st and 2nd Regiments, who wore a silver crescent on the front of their caps, I had a large blue flag made with a crescent in the Dexter Corner to be in uniform with the troops." By March 1776, Moultrie had shifted his base of operations and his blue signal flag to Sullivan's Island, where soldiers and enslaved laborers were constructing a new fort of sand and palmetto logs to defend the northern entrance to the harbor. Meanwhile, the British High Command had decided to send an expedition to spearhead the restoration of the rebellious southern colonies. The King's forces rendezvoused off Cape Fear, North Carolina in May. Commodore Peter Parker's fleet then sailed south to Charleston, South Carolina, transporting more than 2,000 British regulars under Major General Henry Clinton. On June 28, 1776, Parker attacked the unfinished fort on Sullivan's Island with 9 warships, collectively mounting nearly 270 guns. Defending it were Moultrie's 2nd South Carolina and a detachment from the 4th South Carolina Artillery, some 435 men with only 31 guns. The British vessels bombarded the fort for several hours, but it withstood their broadsides thanks in part to the spongy palmetto logs, which absorbed the shot into the sand ramparts behind them rather than splintering and inflicting casualties. At one point during the cannon duel, the Moultrie flag was shot down, and Sergeant William Jasper of the 2nd South Carolina, in a celebrated moment of courage, resecured it to the fort wall while under fire, boosting American morale. Clinton's ground troops, which had landed on Long Island, now the Isle of Palms, attempted an amphibious assault across Breach Inlet, but were turned back by Colonel William Thompson's fortified troops. Unable to reduce the fort by sea or land, the British broke off the attack, having sustained significant damage to several of their ships. It was a decisive American victory, and the palmetto quickly emerged as a local symbol of resistance and resilience. A depiction of the native palm was incorporated into the state seal in 1776 to commemorate the Battle of Sullivan's Island. During the nullification crisis of the early 1830s, South Carolinians began producing flags that prominently featured the palmetto. Eventually, a white palmetto would be added to the center of the Moultrie banner to create the first official state flag of South Carolina, which was adopted in 1861 after the state seceded from the Union. Notice that the horns on the crescent of the first official state flag, which was revised in 1910, pointed upward, but did they on Moultrie's 1775 banner? Unfortunately, Moultrie did not discuss its alignment in his memoirs. However, the committee impaneled by the state legislature in 2018 to study the state flag for design standardization believes that the crescent was originally turned counterclockwise, bearing the more familiar orientation of the current state flag. The most compelling source that the committee provided as evidence in its 2020 report is a watercolor depicting the day after the Battle of Sullivan's Island. The artist, Lieutenant Henry Gray of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, was also a participant in the hotly contested engagement. In Gray's painting, the Moultrie flag is visible on the fort's eastern bastion, and the crescent's horns are pointing toward the upper corner of the staff side. The lieutenant would have seen the flag at close range for an extended period of time, which gives his illustration credibility. In addition to debate over the crescent's orientation, an even bigger controversy revolves around what the symbol actually represents. Here, two passionate camps have animated the discussion. One contends that it's a piece of decorative armor called a gorget, or gorget in French, which infantry officers wore as emblems of rank during the 18th century. The other camp argues that it's a crescent moon. The professional historians who've looked into the symbolism of the Moultrie flag's crescent have found no evidence in the historical record to support the gorget theory, and thus doubt its veracity. But that doesn't mean they're ready to endorse the lunar thesis either, as Moultrie did not call it a moon, only a crescent that was inspired by the ones on his men's caps. The practice of wearing crescent emblems on military hats in Charleston predates the outbreak of war with Great Britain. In May 1773, acting Governor William Bull embodied a new light infantry company whose black caps were adorned with silver crescents. Historians believe that the crescent for the cap badge was likely plucked from heraldry, the system of insignia governing the design of coats of arms. The crescent is an ancient symbol, based on the waxing and waning phases of the moon, but it came to represent second-born sons, as well as the hope for glory or good fortune. Ultimately, all that we can say with certainty is that the symbol on the Moultrie flag is a crescent, which, in combination with the iconic palmetto, forms one of the nation's most distinctive state flags, one rooted in the American Revolution. Thanks for watching and for your continued support of South Carolina State Parks.